This morning's sermon is called Do What You Can, and it was written by Peter Fredericks. It's kind of a second of a three-part series he wrote talking about Forest Church mantra, want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. And I was fortunate enough, I believe all three of those are available on Worship Web. I was so intrigued with the first one, and it was pretty well received. I said, I'm going to do number 2, and if I get the opportunity, I will also do number 3. And for those of you who are here for the first or second time, I am not the settled minister. I'm part of the Sunday Services Committee that comes up here, supports the regular minister or our guest ministers, but on occasion will actually provide the sermon. I'm going to read a quick bio about Peter Fredericks. It's one I did before, but that was back in June, and I've forgotten most of it, so I suspect maybe some of you have also. His bio, he writes, one of the ways we help each other discover and claim our belief is by our sharing of our stories, so I'll share part of mine. I was raised in the Catholic Church, but left that faith as a teenager. I did not attend any church again until I discovered Unitarian Universalism in 1987. My discovery of our faith opened my eyes to new possibilities and potentials for religion. I had never heard of a church that did not require you to subscribe to a particular creed or set of beliefs, let alone one that actually supported you in your own personal search for truth and meaning. But that is exactly what Unitarian Universalism is all about. I quickly found a comfortable faith home as well as warm and loving community at my local Unitarian Universalist church. After serving as a lay leader in various capacities and working for nearly 20 years in law and business, I answered my call to ministry in 2002. I graduated from Andover Newton Theological School in 2006 and began serving as the pastor of UU CDC in August of that year. And he, I believe, is a pastor in Pennsylvania. Now for the sermon. Do what you can. Today is the second of our 3-part sermon series dedicated to Reverend Forest Church. As I noted last week, Church spent nearly 30 years as a senior minister of All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in New York City. He was a public theologian who authored 20 books in his lifetime and was a frequent commentator to the public media. After being diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, he sat down to write what he thought would be his last book, and the result was Love and Death, My Journey Through the Valley of the Shadow. Forest Church succumbed to his disease last September, and I believe that September would have been 2009, shortly before publication of his final work entitled The Cathedral of the World, a Universalist Theology. 10 years earlier, Church acknowledged that he was addicted to alcohol and he joined AA. As part of his recovery, he developed a mantra that he said had served him well for the remaining years of his life. It consisted of 3 statements. Want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. Last week I examined the statement, want what you have. This week I would like to offer you my reflections on do what you can. Do what you can. This part of Church's mantra, he tells us, focuses our minds on what is possible, no more, no less, thereby filling each moment with conscious, practicable endeavor. In the simple statement, Church is at once acknowledging that we have power and control over our destiny, while he is also acquiescing to the limitations and boundaries that we experience as human beings. He is orienting us towards the feasible and the achievable, knowing full well that as individuals, we are limited in our reach and our scope. In one of the closing chapters of Love and Death, Church bemoans how much wasted energy we spend trying to do what we can't, and how often we fail to optimize our efforts and thereby achieve the significant goals that do lie within our power. He goes on to tell us that when we quit trying because we fail to achieve our pipe dreams, We overlook all we actually could accomplish by putting our shoulder squarely on the right wheel. When church instructs us to do what you can, he is calling us to let go of dreams of grandiosity and focus on the meaningful accomplishments we can achieve within the content of our everyday lives. This statement is reminiscent of the reading found in our hymnal, written by Unitarian minister Edward Everett Hale more than a century ago. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. While I was reflecting on that simple statement, do what you can, my mind went back to the spring of 1989. The once monolithic Soviet bloc had begun to disintegrate, and the Berlin Wall had just begun to crumble. Students and other pro-democracy forces in China seized what they perceived to be an opportunity to pressure their government to loosen its iron grip on its people, and protesters flooded the streets of the capital, Beijing. The Chinese government, as you may recall, acted swiftly and violently to crush the peaceful protests, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed. If you were like me, there is one image from the Tiananmen Square protest that is burned indelibly into your brain, one of the few images that survive from that time and place. It is the image of Tank Man. We call him Tank Man because his identity has never been known, at least to the Western world. In the video that was smuggled out of the country, we see a column of Chinese tanks rumbling down the street in central Beijing. And we see a lone man carrying what appears to be shopping bags step off the sidewalk and onto the path of the coming tanks. Instead of mowing him down, as they easily could have, the column comes to an abrupt halt in front of him. Tank Man stands stock still in front of the lead tank, and the tanks sit there idling. Then the lead tank tries to maneuver around the man. Each time it does, Tank Man moves sideways to block the tank's progress. Finally, the tank driver gives up and shuts down his engine. The two are at a standoff. This is the iconic image. A lone man standing up for human rights, staring down the barrel of a tank's gun, holding it at bay. Eventually, members of the secret police arrive and remove Tank Man from the scene, and the tanks proceed on their mission of death and destruction. But Tank Man left his mark. We know, of course, that Tank Man did not bring down the Communist Party apparatus. We know that the Chinese government suppressed the student protests with overwhelming force and violence. We also know that China remains one of the most oppressive countries on the face of the planet, severely limiting many of the freedoms that we here take for granted. And again, this was written probably around 2009. With technology being as amazing as it is now, I believe in China, at least in metropolitan China, you're on candid camera 24/7, pretty much if you're in China. So they have continued to use technology to be just even more friendly than they were before. And while we don't know for sure, we suspect that Tank Man paid for his actions with his life. I have no idea what triggered Tank Man to step off the curb and stand his ground that day, but in one stark and startling moment, he did what he could. And for a few brief moments, it seemed one man stopped the oppressive Chinese regime dead in its tracks. Last week I mentioned the Marianne Williamson quote that has, over the years, been attributed to Nelson Mandela. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. This statement is highly inspirational, and I think it speaks the truth, but it is not entirely true. It is, in some ways, a statement more about the limits of our imagination and self-perceptions than it is a statement about the extent of our powers. The truth is that most of us are not like Tank Man. The truth is that the effort that most of us make is going to be of the drop in the bucket kind. But as you heard in today's reading, that drop just might really matter. Gordon McKeeman warns us against the unspoken assumptions of the drop in the bucket mentality. We assume that a full bucket is what we're aiming for, and that until that bucket is full, nothing has been accomplished. And I love that question that hits us right between the eyes. Why is it that our image is of the first drop in the bucket? The implication being that our drop may be the last one, the one more that fills the bucket. In his book, The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell talks about how little things can make a big difference. Using viruses as a model for explaining social change, he tells us that a small change in behavior can alter the course of society. He writes that we are, as humans, heavily socialized to make a kind of rough approximation between cause and effect. Viruses and epidemics, both medical and social, do not work this way. In fact, he goes on, oftentimes the effect of a seemingly small cause can be huge. To appreciate the power of epidemics, he writes, we have to abandon this expectation of proportionality. We need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that sometimes big changes follow from small events, and that sometimes these changes can happen very quickly. This tipping point theory is dramatically demonstrated by the story of the 100th monkey. While not verified scientifically, the story is at least illuminating as a parable. Back in the 1950s, scientists were studying the behavior of a certain type of monkey on an isolated island of Japan. They noticed that most monkeys would eat the staple of their diet, sweet potatoes, fresh from the ground. But then they observed that one monkey took a sweet potato down to the nearby shore and washed it in the water. Other monkeys on the island, watching this behavior, soon began to copy it. More and more monkeys began to wash their meals before eating them. And then something amazing happened. As we are told, once a critical mass of monkeys on this island was washing its sweet potatoes, the so-called 100th monkey, the same behavior began to occur in monkey populations on other nearby islands, unconnected to the first colony. When a tipping point was reached, there somehow was communicated to other monkey colonies and the message, wash your sweet potatoes. And they did that without Facebook or email. The point of all this is to say that by doing what we can, we are doing one thing for certain and possibly another. First, and for certain, we are having a local and immediate impact. Whether it is making sure that the homeless family has a roof over its head and meals to eat when we volunteer for the Interfaith Hospitality Network, or is it writing a letter to our representatives in Harrisburg to advocate for reasonable gun control measures, these actions have immediate effects and consequences. Secondly, and perhaps less certainly, when we do what we can, we are adding our drop to a bucket that may be nearly full, that may be balanced on its edge and near the tipping point. We may be that 100th monkey whose action sparks the epidemic of social change. With all this being said, I ask you to notice that church's phrase, do what you can, has a Buddhist ring to it. It does not concern itself with consequences, and it asks us to release ourselves from attachment to outcomes. Do what you can. A simple imperative to act within the scope of our ability. Don't worry about the impact. That will take care of itself. While Forrest was eminently practical in his approach to life, he accepted that life is ultimately a profound mystery and that the impact of our lives cannot be known. In their work, How Can I Help?, Ram Dass and Paul Gorman tells us that service is ultimately a journey into the unknown. If we obsess over the effect of our actions, whether they're the first monkey or the 100th, the last drop in the bucket or the first, we may, because of the apparent fertility, simply choose never to act at all. Doss and Gorman tell us that we have a choice to make. We can either be frustrated and worn out by uncertainty and doubt, they write, or try to find a way to open to the ambiguity, embrace it, work with it, be moved and inspired by it, and thereby come closer to the very heart of service, where true freedom is found. This letting go of outcomes is embedded in Forest Church's simple statement. And it rings true to the statement of Jesus when, after telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, he instructed the lawyer simply to go and do likewise. Ram Dass says, "We give it all we have and trust the rest to God, to nature, to the universe. We do everything we can to relieve someone's suffering, but we are willing to surrender attachment to how we want things to be." On that bright blue day in June of 1989, in a stunning act of courage, the tank man did what he could. He stood. He simply stood. He stood in front of a column of tanks, preventing their passage, at least for a time. I doubt he thought it was going to bring the Chinese government to its knees. I doubt even he thought the tanks were going to stop. But he did what he could. He stood for freedom. He stood for justice. He stood for the oppressed people of his country. Let the image of this one courageous soul stand as the inspiration to us as we heed Forest Church's call to do what you can. Go and do likewise. Amen, and blessed be.